He had called them a mongrel nation, undisciplined, soft, a country of jazz musicians and movie stars who had never known real war. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt believed it, deeply, the way men believe things they have never been forced to test. Then, he sat in an Allied interrogation room in 1945, and the Americans gave him paper, and he wrote. What he wrote was not what he had said before. The silence between those two moments, the contempt and the confession, that is where this story lives. To understand what the German generals eventually admitted, you first have to feel the world as they felt it in the early years, not as hindsight, not as strategy annotated in comfortable libraries, but as lived certainty. Germany's senior commanders in 1939 and into the early 1940s operated inside a framework of genuine professional confidence. They had studied war for decades. The Wehrmacht had moved through Poland in weeks, through France in a matter of months campaigns that had stunned even some of the men who executed them. The German officer class carried with it an old institutional pride, a belief that their system of military thinking, the Auftragstaktik, the doctrine of mission-based initiative, of officers trusted to act without waiting for orders from above, was simply the most advanced in the world. They had built their careers on that belief, and the early years of the war had seemed to confirm it. America existed at the edge of this mental picture, and not as a serious figure. The United States Army in 1939 was smaller than Portugal's. American industrial power was acknowledged in the abstract, the way one acknowledges weather in a distant country theoretically possible, not personally threatening. What the German High Command did not model, what they perhaps could not bring themselves to model, was the speed. The sheer organizational velocity at which a democracy they had dismissed could convert a peacetime economy into the largest military production enterprise in human history. Erich von Manstein, widely regarded as one of Germany's finest operational minds, would later write in his memoirs that the Wehrmacht faced a material inferiority on the Western Front that became insurmountable. But he did not write that until after. Before the landings, before the drive across France, before the factories in Detroit had run 3 full shifts for 3 full years, the contempt was sincere. It was not a performance. These men genuinely believed that American soldiers would fold under pressure, that their officers would lack the hard-edged professional ruthlessness required, that a nation that had been neutral, comfortable, and cinematically optimistic could not produce men capable of real war. That belief had a name. They called it Americanismus, a word they used almost dismissively, associating American culture with surface and spectacle rather than depth and endurance. They were about to begin learning something different. The learning did not happen all at once. It rarely does. It came in increments, each one slightly more unsettling than the last, in the way that a man who is wrong about something important does not usually realize it in a single moment, but in a slow series of moments that he keeps finding ways to explain away. North Africa was one of those moments. When American forces first engaged German units in Tunisia in early 1943, the initial results seemed to confirm German assumptions. At the Kasserine Pass in February 1943, American forces suffered serious losses and were pushed back. For the Wehrmacht commanders observing, this looked like proof. Inexperienced, poorly led, exactly what they had expected. But something else was also happening, something the German officers noted with less comfort the Americans learned. With a speed that was, by the standards of how armies usually adapted, genuinely unusual, American commanders reorganized, retrained, replaced officers who had not performed, and came back. General Jürgen von Arnim, who commanded German forces in Tunisia and was captured in May 1943 when the North Africa campaign collapsed entirely, would later describe his surprise at how quickly the American military absorbed lessons and implemented changes. He had expected static incompetence. What he encountered instead was a system that treated failure as information. By the time German forces in North Africa surrendered more than 250,000 Axis troops captured in May 1943, a catastrophe of the first order, the generals sitting in that Tunisian dust were already being separated, catalogued, and prepared for interrogation. Some of them would spend the remainder of the war as prisoners, watching from a careful distance as the thing they had dismissed continued to grow. What they watched growing was not just an army. It was a production system that seemed to operate by different physical laws than anything they had planned against. Germany's war economy was efficient by European standards. But by 1944, American factories were producing more aircraft in a single month than Germany produced in several. The Liberty ship's cargo vessels, built in prefabricated sections and assembled with assembly line logic, were being launched at a rate that German naval planners found almost disorienting to calculate. One ship roughly every few days. Thousands over the course of the war. The submarine campaign that Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had believed could strangle Allied supply lines was being outpaced not by better anti-submarine tactics alone, but by the simple arithmetic of replacement. Dönitz would later write that the Battle of the Atlantic was ultimately decided by American shipbuilding capacity. He did not write that gladly. Hit subscribe right now, because what he admitted next changes everything. Do not go anywhere. June 6, 1944. If there is a single day that compressed all of the German High Command's unexamined assumptions into one shattering collision with reality, it was that morning on the Norman coast. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded Army Group B responsible for the Atlantic Wall defenses, had argued before the invasion that the Allies had to be stopped on the beaches. If they got inland, if they established themselves and brought their supply system ashore, the weight of American and Allied material would make the outcome mathematically inevitable. He understood this, which made June 6th not just a military defeat, but a personal confirmation of his deepest fear. The Atlantic Wall, the line of fortifications that German propaganda had presented as impregnable, was breached on the first day. Not everywhere Omaha Beach cost American forces tremendously, and the men who crossed that sand did so through conditions of violence that the German defenders, watching from their positions in the bluffs, apparently found almost incomprehensible in terms of the courage required. German officers who were captured in Normandy in the weeks following D-Day and later interrogated described their bewilderment at the American willingness to continue advancing under fire that had already destroyed so much. Rommel himself had written to his wife in the preceding months about his genuine uncertainty. His letters, recovered after the war, show a man who was not as confident as his public posture suggested. He wrote about the Allied air power, the fighter bombers that prowled over German positions, making daylight movement of reinforcements nearly impossible in terms of something close to dread. Every road, every column, every fuel depot was visible from above and reachable within minutes. The German army's ability to maneuver, which had been its central military advantage for 5 years, was being systematically removed from it not by another army in the field, but by machines in the sky, American and British machines produced in numbers that German planners had not adequately believed were possible. By late July 1944, the American breakout at St. L Operation Cobra made what Rommel had feared explicit and irreversible. General Omar Bradley's forces moved with a speed and coordination that surprised even some Allied commanders. Von Rundstedt, watching the campaign unfold, reportedly told the OKF, the German High Command, that the war in the West was lost. He was relieved of command for saying it. Being honest about American military capability had become, inside the German High Command, professionally dangerous. Remember what the generals believed at the start? Here is where it breaks. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The senior German commanders who survived Rundstedt, Manstein, Heinz Guderian, Albert Kesselring, and others were taken into Allied custody, and in the months and years that followed, they were interviewed, interrogated, and asked to write historical studies. The Americans, methodical in their own way, wanted to understand the war from the inside. They established programs, most significantly through what became the Foreign Military Studies program, in which captured German officers were asked to write detailed accounts of specific campaigns and operations. What emerged from those rooms was remarkable, not because the Germans suddenly became different men, but because the audience had changed. They were no longer writing for Hitler, no longer performing certainty for subordinates who needed to believe in the mission, no longer posturing for an alliance that required a projection of strength. They were writing for American officers who already knew how the war had ended, and there was a particular quality of candor that crept into those pages. Von Rundstedt, in his assessments, addressed American logistics with a respect that would have been professionally unthinkable for him to express in 1942. He described the Allied supply system, the capacity to move fuel, ammunition, food, and men across an ocean and then across a continent at the scale and pace that was actually achieved, as something that exceeded what German planning had considered seriously possible. He did not call it miraculous. He called it decisive. For a man of his generation and background, that word, in that context, carried enormous weight. Guderian, the architect of German armored doctrine, wrote about American tank production with a similar quality of reluctant precision. Germany had produced excellent tanks, the Tiger and Panther were, in specific engagements, technically superior to most of what they faced. But Guderian wrote that technical superiority in individual systems meant very little against an opponent who could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. By 1944, American factories were producing Sherman tanks at a rate that German production could not approach. The Sherman was, in many respects, outgunned by its German counterparts. But there were so many of them, and when one was destroyed, another was already on a ship. Kesselring, who had managed the German defense of Italy with considerable skill, wrote about American infantry with a specificity of observation that suggested genuine study. He noted the adaptability of American units at the small unit level, the ability of sergeants and junior officers to improvise solutions to tactical problems without waiting for direction from above. He found this quality, which was in some ways similar to German Auftragstaktik doctrine, surprising in an army that his assumptions had categorized as hierarchically rigid. The Americans were not following a script. They were solving problems. And they were solving them faster, on average, than his defensive positions could respond to. The European theater produced most of the written confessions, but the Pacific was not silent on the matter of American strength. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, who served in senior Japanese naval positions and was one of the few high-ranking Japanese officials to openly advocate for ending the war before the atomic bombings, had understood something about American industrial capacity as early as 1942 that many of his colleagues refused to accept. He reportedly stated that the attack on Pearl Harbor had been a catastrophic strategic error, not in its tactical execution, but in its consequences, that it had unified a country that might otherwise have remained divided about entering the war. The sleeping giant framing that is sometimes attributed to Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku in various forms, the idea that Japan had awakened. Something it could not put back to sleep reflected a fear that existed among the more analytically clear-eyed members of the Japanese senior command almost, from the beginning. What Japanese commanders admitted after 1945 in interrogations and in later memoirs was that they had understood, at varying points and with varying degrees of acceptance, that the material balance was irreversible. The island-by-island campaign in the Pacific Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, was not simply a military campaign. It was, from the American side, a logistical exercise of almost incomprehensible scale, projecting power across thousands of miles of open ocean against fortified positions held by defenders who were prepared to fight to the last. The Japanese commanders who survived and were later interviewed described their experience of watching American forces absorb casualties and continue with a steadiness that they had not anticipated. The assumption had been that American public opinion, democratic and therefore fragile, would demand an end to the bloodshed before Japan's defensive perimeter could be broken. That assumption was wrong, and the Japanese commanders who lived to reflect on it knew precisely how wrong it had been. All of the written assessments, all of the interrogation transcripts, all of the memoirs published in the years after the war converge on a single admission that the generals and admirals of the Axis arrived at from different directions, but reached in approximately the same place. They had not taken American power seriously enough. Not the industrial power, not the organizational power, and this seems to have surprised them most, the human power. The soldiers, the adaptability, the willingness to absorb loss and continue. Von Rundstedt's assessment, written in Allied captivity, includes his conclusion that the Western Allied forces with American strength, as their core represented a military capability that Germany had been unable to match in the critical dimension of sustainment. He could fight battles. He could not fight the factory. No general can defeat the conditions that produce the army. Manstein, in his memoir Lost Victories, which was published in 1955, and which he wrote with one eye clearly on his own legacy, nonetheless acknowledged that the material preponderance of the Allied forces, American production above all, had created a situation in which German tactical and operational skill could delay but not reverse the outcome. He called it a struggle between German operational art and Allied material power. He believed, and wrote openly, that in such a struggle the material wins. Eventually, always, there is a quality to these confessions that is worth sitting with for a moment. These were not humble men. They did not arrive at these admissions easily or happily. Manstein spent considerable energy in the same memoir arguing for the quality of German military thinking, distancing himself from the political decisions of the regime he had served, building the case for his own professional legacy. And still, inside those pages, the admission is there. He had encountered something he had not planned for, had not adequately respected, and had not been able to overcome. That is the confession. Not delivered in a single sentence, not spoken cleanly for the historical record, but present in the accumulated pages of men who had once called America soft now, writing carefully, in quiet rooms, about why they had lost. The generals came home, those who survived, to a Germany that was physically and morally destroyed. They wrote their memoirs. They gave their interviews. Some were tried, some were not. They lived the rest of their lives in the long shadow of what they had been part of. But in those interrogation studies, in those foreign military studies pages, in the careful sentences of men who had once looked at a country of jazz musicians and movie stars and seen nothing to fear in all of that writing, a truth surfaces that is genuinely worth holding. They had looked at America and seen only the surface. They had measured the peacetime army, the political noise, the geographic distance. They had not measured what lay underneath: the organizing capacity, the industrial depth, the democratic stubbornness that does not read like military virtue until you are on the wrong side of it. What the Nazi generals admitted about America, only after 1945, was not a secret. It was something they had simply refused to believe until the evidence was no longer avoidable. That is the answer to the question this story began with. The contempt was real. The confession was real. And the distance between them, measured not in miles, but in years and lives, and the ruins of a certainty that was never as solid as it felt that distance is where the history actually lives. They called America soft. Then they wrote, in occupied silence, about why they lost. That quiet reversal is the most honest thing they ever said about the war, and they only said it after it was over. If this kind of history matters to you, the war told through the eyes of those who lost it, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you another story from that other side of the record. If this one stayed with you, leave it a like, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We read every one. We will see you in the next one.